Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back. I'm your host, Paul Barter. This week I ran a short training session about parking policy, as I often do. At the start of the session, I challenged the participants with 4 questions designed to help them examine their mindsets and key assumptions about car parking in cities. For this episode of Reinventing Parking, I want to quickly share the questions with you and talk about the lessons we can learn from them. If that sounds a bit dreary, bear with me. I think you'll find it surprisingly interesting and revealing. You might even get some insight into your own parking mindsets. And for that reason, I have a request, or 2 requests really. First, as you listen to each question, I want you to make a mental note, or an actual note, of your answer. As I joked in the training session, one good answer is always, "It depends." But do try to choose a real answer. You will face some dilemmas since the real-world answers vary depending on context, which makes "it depends" a tempting answer for some of them. One way to zero in on one answer is to answer as if your ideal parking policies have come true, but assume that everything else about the world is the same as our world. That was the first request. The second request is to imagine the answer that would come from someone with parking policy views very different from your own. So you will have 2 answers to every question, your own and that other person's. So get yourself ready. After I read all the questions, I'll then circle back and discuss the significance of each question and the main insights I think we can gain from it. You'll get more from that part of the episode if you have your answers in mind or noted down somewhere. By the way, if you ever run trainings or give presentations on parking reform and you want to make use of any of these questions, then feel free, especially if you mention where you got them, of course. Okay, here are the questions. Question 1 is about where you think motorists should park. Someone arrives by car in an area for a meeting. In your ideal parking world, where should they park? You have 2 options to choose from. A, the motorist should park in the parking lot or garage on the site that includes their destination. Parking anywhere else creates the nuisance called spillover parking. Or, option B, it is fine for the motorist to park in public use parking or well-managed street parking somewhere near their destination. That's not spillover or a nuisance. It's just normal parking in a walkable park once and walk urban district. So, to summarize the question, is it best if people park on-site in their destination, option A, or is it okay if people just park legally in well-managed parking nearby? And remember, please choose 2 answers, your answer and the answer you would expect from your arch parking opponent or someone else. Okay, moving on. Question 2 is about parking fees and paying for parking. For off-street public car parking, which of the following parking fee options best matches your thinking on fees? 1. Parking should be free of charge for the user. Option 2. There should be a user fee, but it should be capped to ensure the cost is reasonable. And reasonable would need to be defined, of course. Option 3. The parking fee should be whatever the market decides. Option 4. The fee should be set at whatever works to ration the parking use and prevent the parking from becoming overly full. 5. The parking fee should be set high enough to recover the full internal costs of the parking facility. That includes operations, construction, and land. And finally, option 6. It's the same as option 5, except that in addition to recovering full costs, the fee should also include an additional impost that is justified by the external social environmental costs of driving, such as congestion costs. That was a lot, so let me summarize the options. 1 is free of charge parking. 2 is quote-unquote reasonable fees. 3 is a market-based fee. 4 is a fee that is whatever it takes to prevent full parking. 5 is an ordinary cost recovery fee. And 6 is a cost recovery fee plus an extra payment because of external costs of driving. So think about your answer and think about the answer of your parking policy opponent, real or hypothetical. That's 2 questions down, 2 to go. The next question, question 3, is about your views on the right quantity of parking. In your ideal parking policy world, how much car parking is the right amount for each location? Again, there are 6 options, but they're shorter this time. Option 1, it's better to overdo parking supply than to have a shortage of parking. Option 2, supply should match actual demand, with parking free of charge. Option 3, supply should match actual demand, but this time with fees. Of course, very much depends on how the fees are set. Option 4, the right supply is whatever the real estate market provides. In other words, open option for developers and builders, like in a city that has abolished parking mandates. Option 5, parking supply should be consistent with the mobility plans for the whole area. Option 6, limit parking supply to the amount that would not overburden the roads with generated traffic. While you're thinking about the answer, and the answer of your parking policy nemesis, let me restate the options in a shorter way. Option 1 is that oversupply is better than undersupply. Option 2 is to match supply with demand, but with free of charge parking. Option 3 is also to match supply with demand, but this time with parking fees. Option 4 is let the real estate market decide. Option 5 is ensure parking supply matches the transportation plan. And 6 is limit parking to the amount that keeps congestion under control. The last question is about on-street parking stakeholders. So question 4, who should have the most say about how each section of on-street parking should be managed? This time there are 4 options. 1, only established owners of homes or businesses close to each space should have a say. No one else should have any input, not even owners and tenants of new buildings. Option 2 is similar. Only residents or business owners close to each space should have a say, but without making a distinction between incumbents and newcomers. Option 3, the whole community should have a say, but owners, residents, and businesses close to each space should have somewhat more say. Option 4, hey, the streets belong to everyone. No one should have any more rights or say over the parking than anyone else. Are you thinking about your favourite? How would someone with very different opinions about parking answer this? While you're thinking, I'll summarise the options again quickly. Option 1 was that only long-standing owners of nearby property should have a say, and after some cut-off date, even new owners, residents or business owners, should not have a say. 2 was that people nearby, both established and newcomers, should have a say. 3 was to listen to the whole community, but with a little more weight for people nearby. Option 4 was that no one should have any more say than anyone else. So, that was 4 questions aimed at helping people understand their mindsets about parking. Each question sheds light on some common assumptions about parking. We will see that some of these assumptions are helpful and healthy for our cities, others not so much. What struck you about the questions and their possible answers? Well, one especially striking thing is that the range of answers to each question is huge. It's amazing that the possible answers to these questions vary so much, really. And despite the huge contrasts between answers, all of them are realistic. We can pick any of the answers, and someone, somewhere, really does answer that way. This wide range of realistic answers helps us to see that the world of car parking has a wide range of different mindsets. That's one reason we so often see parking debates at cross purposes, with participants baffled or even appalled by the claims of their opponents. The answers to these four parking questions are also realistic in another way. Policies and practices based on almost all of these answers have been tried in actual practice somewhere in the world. In fact, in many cities, several different answers to any one of these questions are probably being applied simultaneously to different kinds of parking or in different areas of the city. An obvious example is that many cities have downtown areas that are park once and walk areas where parking fees are market based or demand based or both, and where parking supply is lower than the market based level because of parking maximums. Yet almost all of the same cities that have that situation in their downtown also have suburban areas where most parking is on-site, private use parking, free of charge for motorists, and provided in huge quantities, in part as a result of high parking mandates. Now let's take a closer look at the thinking behind the answers to each question. As we do that, you will want to have your answers handy, or at least have them in mind. Question 1 was over where parking should be: on-site, in their destination, or in well-managed parking anywhere in the neighbourhood. That's a much more important issue than it seems. The contrast between the two answers is central to what I think of as the most pivotal mindset difference in parking policy. The first answer reflects the mindset that justifies parking mandates, also known as minimum parking requirements. It's the mindset that worries that parking outside a destination is a nuisance called spillover parking. It's the mindset that wants plentiful on-site parking and is happy that such parking usually becomes private use parking, open to employees only, customers only, tenants only. And the other answer is based in what I call the walkable parking mindset. It's the approach that welcomes park once and walk areas. In this view, it's normal to park in public use parking somewhere in the area, not necessarily at your destination, and to walk to where you want to go, or to various places you want to go. I'm emphasizing this because I find that even many parking reformers tend to underestimate the importance of this particular mindset contrast. When arguing against parking mandates, many of us mount arguments focused on the amount of parking. We point out that the parking requirements overestimate how much parking is needed. That's fine, but the quest to reform parking mandates is not just about changing people's assumption about how much parking there should be. We'll get to that in question 3, of course. But fighting mandates is also about this issue of where motorists should park. It's just as crucial as the quantity. Being aware of this issue lets us push to abolish parking mandates, even in places where the parking standards are moderate. We can argue against parking mandates even in areas where they don't overestimate the amount of parking needed. Just the fact that they mandate on-site parking is problematic. That promotes private use parking. It harms the prospects for making parking more compatible with walkable urbanism. Promoting on-site private use parking makes park once and walk areas difficult to create. It's not just mandating parking that is wrong. Mandating on-site parking is also a problem. Cities will do so much better on parking policy if we can escape the mindset that expects motorists to park on-site at their destinations. Let's embrace the idea that parking can and should serve its neighbourhood, not just the site that it is on. Let's move on. Question 2 was about parking fees for off-street public car parking. And the possible answers were free parking, reasonable fees, market prices, trial and error or demand-based fees, cost recovery fees, and finally, fees for cost recovery plus the external costs of driving. There were some very different ideas about fees there. And most of us know that there is often a large gap between the fee options that feel right to ordinary motorists who haven't thought about this very much and what seems right to most of us parking reformers. Many people seem to see no problem with free parking or so-called reasonable fees, even if it obviously means that someone must be subsidizing that parking. This question was focused on off-street public use parking. It's the kind of parking that we expect to be common in park once and walk areas that were mentioned in question 1. And this is the kind of parking where subsidies are especially difficult to justify. But that doesn't stop some cities. Many cities do provide off-street public use parking for free or at prices well below the nearby market rates. And this tendency to expect free or cheap parking is usually worse for private use of street parking, where it's assumed that the property owners will benefit from making their parking free or very cheap. It's also worse for on-street parking, where the reason for parking fees is rationing, not costs. And many cities fail to explain that very well, or at all. And on-street parking used by residents seems to be the category of parking where the belief in free or cheap parking is most widespread and difficult to challenge. Sigh. It's also interesting to notice something else about the fees answers at both ends of the spectrum. Free parking at one end and expensive parking at the other. Both are highly interventionist. They have very different purposes, but both of those sets of answers involve a great willingness to impose a different outcome from the market-based and demand-based outcomes in between. By the way, the answers to this question don't necessarily just run simply from cheapest to most expensive. It might seem that fees for full cost recovery plus external costs would result in the most expensive parking, but not necessarily. As mentioned earlier, it depends on demand and supply. Remember the supply restricting answers to question 3 about supply? If policy is based on those answers in at least part of the city, such as the city centre, then fees that are demand-based or market-based can end up very high, maybe even higher than a cost-based price or even a cost plus externalities price. Conversely, in locations with a glut of parking supply, the demand-responsive price will be very low or zero. These demand-responsive price options in the middle of my list of answers don't determine the price levels, but they do mean that high prices or low prices would tell us something about the balance of parking demand and supply. They would provide useful information. So that brings us to question 3, which probed attitudes on the proper amount of parking that should be provided. Possible answers here were be sure to have more than enough parking or supply enough to match demand, which was actually various options depending on the approach to parking fees, either free of charge or any of the various fee setting options. Then there was open option parking, which means letting real estate actors decide for themselves on supply. And then there were 2 planning-based approaches: make sure the amount of parking matches the transportation plan, or limit parking to keep traffic manageable. We saw just now that the answers to this question interact with the fees question. Certain answers to this question limit your options on the fee question and vice versa. If you want plentiful parking, you are unlikely to also want high parking prices for motorists. And if you do, you're going to be disappointed. Answers to this question also interact with the first issue of on-site parking mindset versus park once and walk mindset. The notion that parking really belongs on-site at destinations leads people into supporting and defending excessive parking mandates because that seems like the only way to achieve that ideal of on-site parking. Even reforms to right-size the parking mandates to match demand are a tough sell in a city where everyone holds the on-site parking mindset. And assuming that every site needs to meet its own parking demand makes it very difficult to even think about restricting parking supply. Conversely, if park once and walk thinking is common, then a wide range of attitudes to supply are possible. In park once and walk areas, much of the parking typically comes to be actively managed. The owners of parking will tend to price their parking. They will learn quickly about the actual demand for their parking. We can trust them, and we can trust future builders to pay attention to these signals and get the supply about right. Limiting supply also becomes thinkable in a park once and walk area where parking is well managed. Even boosting supply is not necessarily anathema in park once areas, but the costs of doing so become more obvious if the only way to boost supply beyond what the market wants is to explicitly subsidize parking. And boosting on-site supply via parking mandates is definitely off the agenda in park once and walk thinking. I have two more comments about this question before we move on. First, it is again a little shocking if you think about it, that most of these answers strike many people as radical. In car-dependent places, the first two answers dominate people's thinking. They believe that the authorities should make sure there is either enough parking, with parking free of charge, or more than enough parking, just to be safe. The cost of all that parking is somehow forgotten or overwhelmed by the fear that any hint of parking shortage is a disaster. It's understandable in some ways, since the various harms to society from an oversupply of parking, such as high housing costs, car dependence, and cross-subsidies for drivers, are long-term chronic problems that are not immediately visible, whereas even mild parking shortage results in immediate effects and management efforts that are easily noticed by motorists and keenly felt, even if they are effective and good for society overall. Secondly, again, it is interesting that, as for the fees question, answers at both ends of the spectrum here, the answers seeking abundant parking and the answers seeking to restrict parking, are all highly interventionist. Many people are willing to impose a totally non-market outcome on parking supply, compared with the demand-responsive answers in the middle. I guess it's understandable that many people don't trust private actors motivated by profits to behave well. But it is still striking that even many people who support the idea of market economies are highly skeptical when market mechanisms are extended to something like parking, which is usually immune from the laws of supply and demand. Now, the last question, question 4, which is about who should have the power over on-street parking. This one is a change of pace because it is asking a very explicitly political question. A huge number of controversies over on-street parking hinge on attitudes revealed by this question. Recall that the options ranged from the first rather extreme answer, which was to limit power over on-street parking to only long-standing owners of nearby property. The next few answers, step by step, expanded the circle of who should have a say. And the other extreme was that the whole community should be empowered over on-street parking, with no one having more say than anyone else, no compromise. Legally speaking, I think that in most places that last one is the most defensible answer. Streets are, legally, public spaces belonging to the whole community to be managed for the good of all. But in practice, almost every local government everywhere does pay more attention to nearby stakeholders, but they vary in how they do that and how much. This is especially the case if those stakeholders have the power to assert themselves and wield influence if they are ignored. Let's take a closer look at that most extreme answer, the first option that privileged long-standing incumbent property owners. It sounds kind of feudal, and you might be thinking that it's unrealistic. Well, sadly, no, it is not. In fact, this option is interesting because despite being obviously and awfully unfair, something along these lines is sometimes the least bad way to make some progress on parking reform in residential areas that are otherwise hostile to infill and to parking reform. Some cities make the judgment that the only way to make abolishing parking mandates and parking light or zero parking buildings, the only way to get them through the local political process is to set a date and say, after that date, new buildings in the area will not be eligible for street parking permits. This recognises that these local incumbents have the ability to veto progress, that this is the best we can do. The alternative would often mean keeping parking mandates or seeing them reinstated. This compromise is indeed annoying and unfair, but it does at least let us make progress. More generally, most of the answers to this question, the ones in between the two extremes, recognise that in the real world, we can't just ignore nearby stakeholders. Donald Shoup's parking reform ideas address this via parking benefit districts. I like to talk about sweetening the deal for stakeholders. But cities do need to be very careful. We need to make sure that any compromises with these local stakeholders retain the essentials of effective parking management and avoid undermining parking reform and its wider goals. For example, don't mandate parking to appease anybody, and don't ease back on enforcement or pricing for the sake of such people. Consider offering them something that they like, but only if parking management can still be implemented and made to work well. And that's where I'm going to stop. Thanks to everyone who is still with me after a rather wonkish episode. I think each of these questions and their ranges of possible answers do help bring to the surface the various hidden assumptions that people hold about parking. So I hope it was helpful. Bye for now. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.